How's it going, everybody, and happy 2022 NFL playoff season. As this video is going up on Saturday morning, we have our first playoff games here for this NFL season. We've got the Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Cincinnati Bengals later this afternoon, and we've also got the Buffalo Bills hosting the New England Patriots. So I cannot wait for those two games. Today, I'll be diving into my first wide receiver rankings of the 2022 fantasy football season. Obviously, a long ways out here, and things are going to change as we approach this coming year. But I want to keep talking fantasy all off season long. We're going to be doing some more Dynasty style content, more prop bets, and DFS style content here throughout the duration of the NFL playoffs. And then obviously we'll be doing NFL draft stuff and continuing to do more fantasy content all off season long. So drop down, click that subscribe button if you're new around here. Well, let's not waste any time. Let's get right in to my number one wide receiver for 2022. All right, so as many of you probably assumed, Cooper Kupp is going to remain my number one wide receiver at the moment heading into 2022 fantasy football. The reasoning for this is very simple. What Cooper Kupp did in his first season with Matthew Stafford as his quarterback with the Los Angeles Rams was unprecedented and something I don't think we've seen in a very, very long time. Now, obviously, the numbers that Cooper Kupp has put up in year one of the new quarterback are something that's unheard of, having 1,947 yards and 16 touchdowns, nearly pacing him out to a touchdown average of one touchdown per game. However, obviously, with the new 17-game format, he fell just shy of that, but nonetheless, the statistical markers he reached this year were fantastic. Obviously, he finished as the wide receiver 1 in 2021 fantasy football. And not only was he the most consistent player in fantasy lineups this season, but he was arguably one of the highest ceiling players as well that you could count on week in and week out, especially in PPR formats, to completely carry your lineup. So moving into year two, the track record that quarterbacks have with offensive-minded head coaches and the progression that they have in their second year in an offensive system, I have all the reason to continue putting my faith into Cooper Kupp in 2022 as the top option on the draft board. The volume he saw this season was ridiculous. I mean, he was far and away the first receiver to the 1,000-yard marker, the 100-target, 100-reception marker. Basically, every milestone this season, he was leading the pack, and he was actually the Triple Crown winner. I believe it was the league lead in receiving touchdowns, receptions, and receiving yards. So high marks for Cooper Kupp. The things he did out of the slot this year, no other player was able to even approach or replicate those type of numbers and usage in the offense that he had for Sean McVay's Rams. And he fell just 17 yards short of breaking the single-season receiving yardage record that Calvin Johnson still remains a hold of after Cooper Kupp did not end up breaking that record. So it was a heck of a season for Kupp. Again, we're moving him into 2022 as our current wide receiver 1, having, again, those expectations of Matt Stafford maybe not having as an extreme of a progression as an Aaron Rodgers did in year number 2 with Matt LaFleur. But maybe, Matt Stafford throws 8 to 10 more touchdown passes and brings down the interception totals a little bit. You never know. I think he'll have things cinched up a little bit better and a better grasp on that offense. And obviously that's going to play all to the benefit of Cooper Kupp and other LA Rams pass catchers. So I think he's a middle first-round pick this year in 12-team leagues. I had him go in our first, I don't want to give it away, but go check out our first-round mock draft video that we did yesterday that I put out. I went through and made each of the first 12 selections of a 2022 fantasy football draft board. Go check out that episode, as well as the early running back rankings that I put out earlier this week to get this 2022 offseason started. So Cooper Kupp lands at the number 1 spot for me. At the number 2 position, I'm going to head Davante Adams, and this is the main way that I had the 2021 season set up for the majority of the year. After it was pretty obvious that Cooper Kupp was going to continue seeing the target volume throughout the entire season that he did early on, and after it was very evident that he was doing something different than every other player in the league, we notched Davante Adams down to the number 2 spot. And he hovered around that number 2 spot, never fell lower than number 3 for me. But then once the Chiefs went through their sort of offensive slump, and we'll get to that in a second here, Davante Adams moved back up as Aaron Rodgers continued to have his MVP season. Davante Adams' talent, his production, his route running ability speaks for itself. Just cut on the tape what he does. I would argue he is the most talented and most well-rounded and therefore the best wide receiver in the NFL, but for fantasy football purposes, the target volume and value that Cooper Kupp provides on a week-to-week floor basis still makes him the better option here. So anyways, Davante, him and Aaron Rodgers, as long as that's the connection in Green Bay, this is going to remain a top 3 wide receiver option for me. The one concern I do have is that Davante Adams is scheduled to be a free agent following the 2021 NFL season. And the bad news there is that there is a rumor right now that if Davante Adams and the Green Bay Packers are unable to, and there is a very real chance that they are unable to come to a long-term agreement because of the cap situation the team has, because of the deficit the team is in for just being in a financial hole with the cap being pulled back due to COVID in 2021. Obviously, the cap number is expected to grow every single season, but last year it took a major hit because of the lost revenue that the NFL had because of COVID, or at least the declining revenue, I should say, in terms of a normal year for the league. That impacted a lot of teams, put a lot of teams over the salary cap, and is making teams make very tough choices. Now, this is not typically the type of conversation you'd expect to be having in terms of fantasy football talk, and especially this is relevant in a dynasty lens here, if that's the type of fantasy league you play, because this impacts Davante Adams' long-term value to your teams in those formats as well. But the rumor right now is that Davante Adams could be a potential franchise tag candidate. And I think that that would be the worst case scenario for not only Davante Adams, because you see a player like a Chris Godwin for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, another really talented Pro Bowl level receiver that has a lot of NFL career left in him. That affects his market value. That affects the price that teams will be willing to pay for a Chris Godwin who tore his ACL while playing on the franchise tag. And we've seen other star players in the past hold out when being on the tag. Now, this is not something that Davante Adams has spoke on. It's not something that he's threatened to do. However, you saw a player like, a Dalvin Cook, who was not happy with his franchise situation and the tag possibilities. And we've seen players in general throughout the last 5 to 6 years be very, very frustrated when playing on the tag. And Davante Adams has come out and said he will not sign a deal, and this was earlier on in either late August or early on in the season for Green Bay. He hasn't really spoke much on his contract situation since, but he talked about how he would not accept to sign for anything less than becoming the NFL's highest paid wide receiver. So, in which he is very much so deserving of, but that's going to potentially cause some tension, and especially with all the drama we had last offseason with Aaron Rodgers and how that impacted Davante Adams' fantasy situation. We'll see what happens with his contract this year, and now that it actually directly affects Davante Adams' bank account balance and all that, there's another element that we have to consider here. So it'll be a very interesting offseason, not only for Aaron Rodgers and what he chooses to do with the team moving forward, but also Davante Adams, because I think that his fantasy outlook and the situation changes very, very drastically if he were to be in different colors next year, or if there is a contract battle between the Green Bay front office and Davante. So a very long-winded explanation there, and not actually talking too much about Davante's talent, but situation matters here. It's Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers' chemistry that makes them so special, and their timing. I talked about this in yesterday's video. It's the subtlety of gestures that just causes them to click, and they're able to, at the line of scrimmage pre-snap, have just an understanding of one another that brings their games to another level and really puts them beyond the defense's capability of stopping. So Davante Adams will be heavily impacted by his contract situation this offseason as much as he will be impacted by the team situation that he's playing for in 2022. I sure hope it's with my Packers. I sure hope it's with my Packers alongside Aaron Rodgers, because that's when Davante Adams will be at his best. However, we've got a long offseason ahead of us, so we'll figure out obviously more as we continue to progress. But some marks from Davante this year. He set the Packers single-season receiving yards record. He had yet another double-digit touchdown season, and in 5 of his last 6 years, he's eclipsed that marker. So you've got a lot of great stuff you're working with here if Davante is a Packer in 2022. Tyreek Hill, I went back and forth between the number 3 and 4 positions here, but But at the end of the day, the reason Tyreek Hill lands one spot higher than the next player you'll see on the list for today's episode is due to the quarterback. Now, Patrick Mahomes has not been playing his best football here this season. He's been playing very efficient and down the stretch of the year, turnover-free football. But the offensive volume of output has been a bit on the decline here this season for Kansas City, as they really struggled to get that unorthodox outside the box, playing outside the system, offense rolling. Patrick Mahomes was really struggling earlier on this season, as the Chiefs were as a whole, as a result, because they weren't able to get the freelance plays to click as easily as they have in the past. And playing outside the structure of the offense hadn't been quite as effective as it had been per se in 2020 or even 2019, which I believe was Patrick Mahomes' MVP season. So Tyreek, for me, though, having such a skilled and talented quarterback who easily, with having another offseason under his belt, could snap out of this whatever you want to call it, funk or slump. Aaron Rodgers even went to say, he might have the quarterback yips, which is something that he talked about on the McAfee show earlier on this season. I think that, there's a chance that they might even snap out of it and get back into it during this postseason. So I'll be watching that very closely. Obviously, I can't wait to get into the postseason games and watch the playoffs here. That's when you see the best football and the best NFL products on display. But I think Tyreek will be just fine next season. He's called Cheetah for a reason. The track speed, the ability to burst downfield and just have an elite explosiveness. I think that when we look at Tyreek's season here in 2021, it was a perfect example of a cautionary tale of a player who had a very high TD count in 2020 and then pulled back here in 2021, and kind of showed how that even moderate drop-off could have such an impact on him as to dropping him from being a top 3 receiver to being in the mix of someone who is a middle tier wide receiver one. He went, his touchdown differential, that is, was a -6 from the 2020 season into 2021 here. So he still had 111 receptions. That is a really great marker to be at. He still had 1,200 yards receiving. But it just shows you that those touchdowns were very important to Tyreek Hill. And again, the offensive funk for Kansas City did have an impact on his 2021 stats. But again, I think that he will push back in a positive direction next season. Travis Kelce, I don't want to write him off, and I'm certainly not going to do that, but he is getting older and older. So I think that younger, fresher legs, although Tyreek Hill is getting into his later 20s now, might potentially be a more coveted option in the passing game for Patrick Mahomes. So we'll see how teams play them in the playoffs. We'll see how they come out swinging next year. But with that QB wide receiver stack, I'm feeling really, really good about this. Tyreek was potentially a league-losing asset for this season in week 16 through 18. Unfortunately, he had just 9.5 total fantasy points in half PPR scoring. But again, I'm looking to move past that and get into a clean slate for the Chiefs offense next season. Justin Jefferson, so I kind of talked about how I went back and forth, and at one point in time, I actually did have Justin Jefferson as my number 3 wide receiver. I moved him down to 4, though, for the simple fact that I just believe in Patrick Mahomes and his ability to provide a weekly ceiling for Tyreek Hill more than I believe in Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins has shown us time and time again that he is more than capable of getting Justin Jefferson those high ceiling games and putting balls in places that Jefferson can make the play and have super, super great fantasy performances. But I expect Patrick Mahomes to deliver more often than I expect Kirk Cousins to, and especially in those primetime games when the lights are at their brightest, when there's the most viewers around the world watching. I believe in Patrick Mahomes' ability to deliver under pressure more so than I believe in Kirk Cousins. So for me, at the end of the day, that's the small difference here. I think that Justin Jefferson's ceiling as a talent and as an NFL player is ridiculous. And maybe, I'm not saying he will, but I think there's a chance he could be a more well-rounded and overall receiver at the peak of his prime than even a Tyreek Hill, maybe even a Davante Adams. And this is coming from a Green Bay Packer fan. That's how much I think about Justin Jefferson. You see Davante Adams' career trajectory and how slow of a start he got off to and the heights he's reached now as a player. And then think about a Justin Jefferson and how hot and how savvy he was as a player in his rookie season, now into year 2, And I would say that this Vikings offense and team as a whole pulled back in terms of their level of success here in 2021 that they had in Jefferson's rookie season in 2020. So again, I think that Justin Jefferson is going to be a dominant player in this league. He clearly already is, and you could argue he is currently a top 3 to 5 NFL player at his position. But I'm going to have him at number 4 here because of the team situation. I would love to see Minnesota bring in an offensive-minded head coach this year. I think that would have a big impact on his fantasy value for teams in the 2022 year. Deebo Samuel is my number 5 wide receiver. When considering the next 2 names after Deebo on the list, it's a very small margin. I think that they're very tightly knit here and are in that next group of wide receivers in terms of if you were going to break this list into tiers. But man, when I really dove into Deebo Samuel's scrimmage yardage production and the value he added as a rusher, it went beyond any expectations I ever could have had for him coming into this year. Now, obviously, being a player drafted in the 8th round, he was a heck of a draft steal and a value pick to begin with. But when you even just look at Deebo Samuel's talents and his skill set and his upside he had as a player, I think he still even shattered the mold this year for what the wide receiver position could look like, and especially look like for him moving forward. Deebo Samuel had 1,770 yards from scrimmage. I knew he was having a great season. I was following him week in and week out, and obviously ranking him in my wide receiver rankings for SFS Gold members every week, and was doing lineup advice all season long and paying very close attention. But when I really took a step back and just realized what it meant to have 1,770 yards from scrimmage, and yes, Cooper Kupp had 1,947 yards just receiving, but Deebo Samuel is a completely different animal, a completely different player, and he actually had more rushing touchdowns than he had receiving touchdowns. He had 14 total, 6 receiving, and 8 rushing on just 59 attempts. So the things he did, again, shattered the mold for what the wide receiver position could be for an NFL offense, and especially what it could be for Deebo Samuel in San Francisco moving forward. So the big concern here obviously would be wear and tear, with Deebo Samuel being a more physical style weapon and being a more dynamic player who is really taking a beating between the tackles more often than other players at his position. However, he is so elusive. His efficiency as a rusher, because of his explosiveness and difficulty to tackle, he is just, I keep saying it, but he is shattering the mold for the wide receiver position. He is, I don't even know if you want to call him a wide receiver. He is obviously a great pass catcher and a great rushing threat, but he is overall an offensive weapon. 14 touchdowns, especially when you consider his level of usage in the run game. It's nothing astronomical. I mean, he only had 59 attempts on the season and didn't really start to see that elite level of rushing attempts in terms of a fantasy perspective until later on in the year. But he was still someone we thought of as a viable weapon in the jet sweep game, and someone who would take some of those wide receiver handoffs to get them out in space that Kyle Shanahan had drawn up, even going back to Deebo's rookie season, the year that San Francisco went to the Super Bowl. So there was a lot of arguments to be made that Deebo was going to see 20 or so rushing attempts this year, maybe just over one of those jet sweep type plays per game, or one of those end arounds or wide receiver reverses. But the end result was much better again than we ever could have expected with his explosiveness, his talent, his physicality. I mean, he is actually bigger than any other San Francisco running back on the roster. That includes Trey Sermon. Deebo Samuel is a freak of nature, and someone that going forward into next year, I would love to see how San Fran continues to use him in these huge playoff matchups, because I think that will also give us a nice glimpse into how he might be used next season, which I expect to be very similar. But imagine if the rushing attempts that Deebo saw at the end of the year is something that's factored into his situation for the entirety of the season, and he continues to develop as a route runner and a playmaker in space when catching the football. So a lot of great stuff, and something I was meaning to get around to here, but then ended up just talking myself into a completely different path, is that The 14 touchdowns is something that I would usually circle as a point of potential regression, but since he's receiving so much work on the ground in producing as a rusher and a receiver, and the abnormality of having more rushing touchdowns at the wide receiver position than receiving touchdowns leads me to believe that there is the opportunity for some really nice sustainability in that particular statistical metric. So Deebo, I would not necessarily panic in terms of having a potential wide receiver touchdown regression there. Ja'Marr Chase is my number 6 wide receiver when breaking this down. He was a really fun player to watch this year. The upside that Joe Burrow brought to the table for him each and every week is in large part similar to what we talk about with Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers, the chemistry. You go back to having them together at LSU, and obviously Ja'Marr Chase won the Blitnikoff Award as the nation's best wide receiver. They won a national championship together, and the Bengals took him 5th overall in the 2021 NFL Draft, and man, he was a hit for sure. He is just a difference maker for this team, and you talk about having another option on the other side of the field in terms of having T. Higgins line up out wide for the Bengals as well. There's only so much an opposing secondary can do to send attention the other direction of, whichever receiver they want to assess as the top threat in the offense on a weekly basis. For me, it's clearly Ja'Marr Chase, again, going back to that chemistry and just the value he provides in the vertical passing game. I can't wait to see how his usage as a more refined route runner in the intermediate and short passing game develops, because I think at the end of the day, they will start incorporating him more into that phase of things as defenses start to play more high looks and not let Joe Burrow stretch the field vertically each and every snap. I mean, they got a lot of single coverage on the outside this year. I think that that's something that'll probably decline next year. And obviously Ja'Marr Chase was very effective doing that. He set the single season rookie receiving yards record, broke his former teammate at LSU, Justin Jefferson's record. He did have 13 touchdowns, where we just talked about with Deebo Samuel as a rusher, and something that might not be overly intimidating for me to decline. Ja'Marr Chase being just a player who sees a few end arounds or a few jet sweeps throughout the season is someone who I would be a little bit more afraid, because he is definitely not a Deebo Samuel or someone that the Bengals would line up in the backfield as a literal running back. So 13 TDs for me, again, is a bit scary. That number could decline next season. Of course, the yardage marker could as well. And at the end of the day, I don't want to overvalue Ja'Marr Chase because he did see 128 targets in his rookie season. He did have 81 receptions. And again, when you do have a legitimate threat to your target volume, that being a T. Higgins or even a Tyler Boyd in the slot, there are other players who deserve targets in this offense. So I don't think Ja'Marr Chase is someone who's going to get to increasingly large target numbers over 140 or 150, because again, other players in the offense are certainly capable of producing. This isn't your Cooper Kupp scenario where you're playing slot receiver and you're getting a heap of targets underneath, having a Robert Woods tear his ACL midseason, a Davante Adams where you're the clear and concise number 1. There is no conversation or debate whether you're the top dog in your offense. Now, I think that just about everyone would tell you that Ja'Marr Chase is the number 1 over T. Higgins, but T. Higgins is still a very, very good number 2 receiver to have, and I would argue he could probably be a number 1 for a handful of teams in the league. So Ja'Marr Chase, the ceiling is something I expect to be present on a week-to-week basis. However, consistency is, I think, where we're going to find some troubles next year. That was a bit of the issue this season, obviously, as not every week you're not able to hit a home run fade ball every single game. And when that's not the case, unless he develops that underneath route tree, I think you're going to see some of those consistency issues carry over into the 2022 season and be something that we're actively talking about. And again, if the touchdowns decline as well, that's something we have to factor into that situation. Stefon Diggs at number 7 for the Buffalo Bills, I think easily could outproduce Ja'Marr Chase, but I think that after the pullback from the 2020 season, it is reasonable to have Stefon Diggs down here. And obviously, when you look at the other weapons in this Bills offense between Dawson Knox's emergence this year, Emmanuel Sanders was here and there. He was a player who had, again, a high ceiling, low floor. Cole Beasley is a decent threat in this offense, although both of those players are very veteran and experienced players that who knows how much longer they'll be around on this roster. And then you've got Gabe Davis, a really, really nice, young, and up-and-coming player heading into his third year. There are other options to go with the football for Josh Allen, as where in 2020, Cole Beasley had some flashes, but Dawson Knox was not even remotely doing the things he is right now, and Emmanuel Sanders wasn't even on the team. And Gabe Davis, was a rookie, making plays in spurts, but not necessarily even a starter for this team on a weekly basis. So Diggs, who was the wide receiver 3, it was, I believe, in 2020, was not quite that in 2021 here. He was still a very, very effective player. He still had a really great season. He had 10 touchdowns on the year. Only 200-yard games, though. That is something that I thought was a bit surprising from a player who had such a high season, high ceiling the year before that, and the fact that he just pulled back a little bit this year was kind of chalked in and expected because of the mass target volume he saw and because of how many of those deep shots Josh Allen was able to connect with Stefon Diggs on. But I think that, he did pull back to the more reasonable side of expectations, and was somebody that was still a very, very deserving wide receiver 1 this year, but wasn't quite the monster producer, is I guess what I'm trying to say, this season as he was last. He did have 10.5 or more fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 performances, so he still gave you that consistent element of being that wide receiver 1 threat in your lineups. But I guess to make a short story long is what I've done here with Stefon Diggs, is he didn't win you your week as often as he did the season prior. So that's something that he could potentially get back to in 2022. I do think that we have to be reasonable, though, with Stefon Diggs. He might have had his best fantasy season already behind him in 2020. I think that he could increase marginally from what he put out in 2021, but at the end of the day, I'm going to manage my expectations and be cautiously optimistic with Diggs' fantasy value for this coming season, because again, he's got a great quarterback. He has the situation under control, but it's those other targets that are starting to emerge around him and the lack of success that Diggs had with Josh Allen on those deeper passing patterns this year that ultimately caused him to have a lesser productive season than he did in 2020. Keenan Allen moving into number 8 here. We're starting to get into the next tier, I would argue, for players that I would say are a notch below that of your Deebo Samuels, your Jamar Chases, your Stefon Diggs. And that's Keenan Allen here starting off this next group. I think you can argue between my number 8 and number 9 player and make a strong argument for both. Keenan Allen is not necessarily the flashy wide receiver target for the fantasy football world or the Los Angeles Chargers offense, but what he is dang consistent, and he is very, very dependable. We talked about just now how Stefon Diggs didn't necessarily have those elite ceiling performances this season that he did, or at least nearly as often as he did in 2020. Keenan Allen almost never gives you those massive ceiling games, but he almost never gives you an entire letdown performance. He is steady Eddie. He gives you a solid 10 to 12 points almost every week in half PPR scoring. PPR leagues, it'd be even better, obviously getting a full point per catch. But what I really believe in with Keenan Allen here is his route running and his quarterback. And he's going to separate from defensive players. Again, he's not someone that's going to go out here and score a super large amount of touchdowns. He's not someone that's going to hit home run balls over the top. But what he is going to do is move the chains. We saw even just last week, the Chargers obviously came up short in overtime against the Raiders, missed the playoffs. But on multiple 4th and long situations in that game, Justin Herbert went to Keenan Allen. He is the number 1 target here. Mike Williams has certainly a higher ceiling, but a much lower floor. But I just trust Keenan Allen if he is my number 2 receiver in my lineup. Now, obviously, we have him ranked as a wide receiver 1, but you would probably hope to have someone with a higher ceiling element on your roster. I just think there's a great opportunity to have consistent weekly success here. So I'm going to continue betting on Justin Herbert as a passer and his upward trajectory as a player, and that's going to trickle down to players like a Keenan Allen or a Mike Williams who are going to reap the rewards of having a quarterback the level of Justin Herbert, and ultimately that'll show up in the statistical categories and obviously the fantasy scoring department. So Keenan Allen, again, a steady Eddie type player. He's just someone that you have confidence and faith in on a week-to-week basis to deliver points, but not necessarily a player who is really more than once or twice a year going to have a performance that wins you your fantasy week. Moving into my number 9 wide receiver now, Jaylen Waddle. As I prefaced before Keenan Allen, I did argue that I think a lot of people could have a strong argument that Jaylen Waddle is more deserving to be drafted before a Keenan Allen, or as an asset you would rather have on your lineup. For me, what it comes down to, again, just like that Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill situation, is I have a lot more confidence in Justin Herbert than I do in Tua Tagovailoa. I'm not really sure in terms of an organizational standpoint what direction the Dolphins are headed in right now. They haven't named a new head coach after letting go of Brian Flores, who obviously had his hand in the defense much more so than he did in the offense. But given how valuable I thought Brian Flores was to that team, I just don't know how much I believe in the Dolphins organization and the decisions they're making from the top down. And obviously this is a lot higher than Jaylen Waddle's fantasy value or his involvement in the offense is concerned. But to me, Jaylen Waddle's a player who, just the situation I don't think is as good for Keenan Allen. I do think the upside and the ceiling for what Jaylen Waddle can be as a player is better than that of Keenan Allen and the heights he's reached at the peak of his NFL career. He's probably getting into the later stages of his prime now, if not starting to slowly exit that prime. Whereas Jaylen Waddle has a whole lot of upside left in front of him. You talk about the floor value he had this season, what a year it was for him. 141 targets, 104 receptions, and 6 touchdowns on the year. That's a 6-touchdown marker I think could easily climb heading into next year. And he was doing some unprecedented things for a rookie wide receiver in terms of his reception count. I really like Jaylen Waddle, and I think that's something that he didn't really tap into too much this season that maybe he could next year, but the one limitation, again, is Tua, is the deep passing game. He didn't really see too many field stretching opportunities this year to put that track speed on display and beat defensive backs deep, and that's something that I think that, if you switch situations here, Justin Herbert, if he were the quarterback of the Dolphins, would be letting it loose, ripping that ball downfield, and probably scoring some massive touchdowns to a player of Jaylen Waddle's speed, athleticism, and route running prowess. He brings a lot to the table, and ultimately what we relied on Jaylen Waddle to bring to us in our fantasy lineups this year was a large target share in the underneath passing game and to use his run after catch capabilities to rack up yards and obviously find the end zone. So I would love to see him unlock that next dimension of being a field stretching asset, and that's where I think he could outscore Keenan Allen this coming season if he's able to do that a bit more this year or increase that touchdown marker. But with Tua, I'm not sure how many opportunities they're going to give Jaylen Waddle to throw the football downfield, and I'm not sure how effective they're going to be doing that again because, they did it at Alabama, but this is a whole other level of competition, having NFL defensive backs that can close the gap between 5 yards of separation in the blink of an eye. So Jaylen Waddle, number 9, I think he could potentially rise up my board here, depending on the coaching hire or any other roster moves that are made for the team this offseason. I'll put Ceedee Lamb down here at number 10. This is someone who I think has the talent to be higher on the list than he is. But overall, I struggle to see a week-to-week offensive identity for the Dallas Cowboys. It seems like the first month of the season every year, they're this great rushing attack. They're pounding the rock. They're rushing for over 100 yards a game. And Dak Prescott is on fire. And then once Zeke starts to wear down, Tony Pollard had an injury this year, they completely do a 180 and they become a one-dimensional passing offense, in which case their passing offense really struggles because they're not able to have the play action game set up for them or really have favorable looks on the defensive side of the ball because everyone knows what's coming from their offense. So Ceedee Lamb's a really boom-bust player. It's a similar situation and concern, a complaint of mine from another guy in this offense, Amari Cooper, who I would say is even more so boom-bust than a Ceedee Lamb is for this Dallas offense. But Just some things that aren't the greatest news here. He had 4 games this season with 5 points or fewer in half PPR scoring. Another 4 games with 8 points or fewer. So that's 8 games. Dang near half your season, you're producing 8 points or less in fantasy. He was the wide receiver 17 finisher. So I think that was underwhelming to begin with Ceedee Lamb. Excuse me. Wow, I really got tongue twisted there. And then he had, on the other side of things, so this is where that boom element comes in, he had 4 games of 16 points or higher of output in half PPR scoring and only 6 touchdowns. So just like I just mentioned with Jaylen Waddle, 6 touchdowns is a very realistic marker where you could expect an improvement in that category as opposed to some of the players higher on the list that were in the middle teen range that I would expect a slight drop off from. So Ceedee Lamb heading into next year, he clearly has the talent. I think Dak Prescott is the guy for the Cowboys. Obviously, he's on a long-term deal, and I believe in him as a passer, but they have got to figure this thing out and how to get more consistent in the future. That's what it's going to boil down to for Ceedee Lamb. I've seen him look like the real deal even as early as week 1 this year, and obviously we saw flashes in his rookie season. But even again, in this season, he's had great moments. The walk-off touchdown against the Pats in overtime to win that game. Against Tampa Bay week 1, he looked unstoppable. They just got to find ways to get him the football more. He did deal with an ankle sprain this year. That might have slowed him down and had an impact on how he finished this year because he didn't have a touchdown after week 10. So there was a lot of different things to take into consideration with this Dallas offense in 2021. I think, though, heading into year 3, he's going to continue to develop as a player, increase and expand his role in this offense, and I think that he has the opportunity, again, as many players on this list do, to outscore or outproduce the expectations I'm laying out for them right now. A.J. Brown at number 11 here. I'll put him lower on the list because of the offensive situation he's in. This is very clearly and evidently a run-first football team. That is what the Tennessee Titans are built upon, the power run game and setting up play-action passes. And that sets up A.J. Brown for great success in the over-the-top passing game. But the one issue he's had is injuries and drops. So actually more than one injury. But he's had injuries, drops early on this season, which actually resulted in him getting benched. He claimed he was injured, but a lot of players didn't buy into that. They thought he quit on the team. Fantasy players, that is. But at the end of the day, this is a really talented player and a guy who can go over the top, make big plays, be dominant after the catch point. And when you really take into consideration the single game production he's had across multiple occurrences throughout his career in all 3 of his seasons, he has the potential to be a dominant player. But when your target volume is a little bit lower because of the nature of the run-first approach for this Titans offense, Ryan Tannehill is not the best quarterback in the world. He is a competent franchise quarterback, but he's a lower ceiling player than some other guys in the league. It's just not the best situation to succeed in. He is someone that we think of as rather boom bust because some games he doesn't get a high target volume head his direction, and I'll talk about that in a second with the number 12 player on the list. But I think there is an opportunity, and when he is healthy, he's a very good player. We've seen him go for absolutely monster games this season, last year, and in his rookie year, where he had over 1,000 yards receiving in just a few starts. So not a few starts, but a handful of starts. Nonetheless, moving forward, I do feel more comfortable in A.J. Brown than even a DK Metcalf, who you won't see on the list today. I think there's a lot to undress with this Tennessee Titans offensive situation, but at the end of the day, I do still have some faith that A.J. Brown can be a high upside, low floor wide receiver 1 for the 2022 season. And lastly, DeAndre Hopkins makes the list here, and the reason he's so low is he's entering his age 30 season. I think he is on the very back stretch of his NFL prime. Injuries have started to become more and more frequent for him. He dealt with a hamstring for a large part of this season, and then after he missed time with that hamstring, he had a knee injury that has cost him time ever since. So hopefully the Cardinals will get him back here in the postseason. I actually have to check on if he's going to be available for the wild card game. I haven't paid much attention to D-Hop since he exited with that knee injury. However, I do think that the main concern for me this year was touchdown dependency. He wasn't seeing his typical target share volume that he had in years past. He only had one 10-target game all season long. He did miss 7 games, but he had one 10-target game in which he was only able to, it was actually 13 targets. So he went from not having a single double-digit target game all of 2021 to, in his last game in which he played against the Rams, he had 5 receptions for 54 yards. Now, obviously, it's a stingy matchup. You've got Jalen Ramsey out there, but he doesn't typically travel as much as he has in years past, so you were unable to capitalize on 8 of your 13 targets. You only haul in 5 for 54, averaging just over 10 yards per catch, but that was, again, your only double-digit target of this season, a target performance of this season. When we look at someone like an A.J. Brown, who I just said is someone who is boom bust, the volume is not always there because of the emphasis on the ground game, because in order for him to get targets, he is getting a deep play action shot set up downfield. A.J. Brown, who missed 4 games, had 3 11-plus target games. So you're looking at an air raid offense with the Arizona Cardinals, which did run the football more this season. I will acknowledge that, but you're still talking about a player who is getting a lot of his opportunities off of play action deep balls, who had 2 more double-digit target games than you did and still missed 4 games on his own as well. So D-Hop's consistency, my faith in him on a week-to-week basis is on a downward slope right now. I will say I would rather have Kyler Murray, obviously, throwing my fantasy player of the football than I would rather have Ryan Tannehill. But it's still a situation that is very real and present at the forefront of our fantasy minds, and with, obviously, the assets that our players have around them. So those are my top 12. DeAndre Hopkins rounds out the list here. I'll be working on making the rest of my top 12, obviously, as we go throughout the offseason. Free agency, however, the playoffs and the postseason happens, and whatever ultimately finishes this NFL season, I will be paying close attention to those games and breaking those down and using that to help assess my 2022 fantasy forecast for next year. But go check out our social media accounts. Those are linked in the description of today's episode, as well as join the SFS community Discord server. The link is also in the description today. That's a free join. I chat in there, send out my prop bets for the playoff games that are happening right now, chat with you guys. I'll set up an occasional mock draft here and there and all that great stuff. So obviously subscribe if you're new around here, turn the bell on so you're never late for an episode, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.